Okay, outstanding. Good evening. I'm Glenn Longabaugh. I'm the regional agronomist for WinField United. And the topic today is different than weed control, which it was last year. It's back to high yield soybeans, which is one of my favorite topics. And I'm tickled to death to share some of the insights. Now, this is a 20-minute deal, Ken, right? This is not the big full dose. If you guys want the full dose, you need to talk to your account rep, right? And tell him, hey, I want that goofy guy from Pike County that knows a little bit about soybeans to come talk about high yield soybeans. And we'll spend about 3.5 hours and we'll do a deep dive on everything from plant physiology to nutrition to maybe some pathology. And at the end of the day, you'll have a much better insight on how to make decisions to impact soybeans for high yield. In Preston's presentation, he had 3 growers. And the one grower, Trent, I believe it was all about doing what? Yeah, he was the early adopter, right? I am so competitive, I'm going to throw everything I can at this crop. Is that who we are here at Superior Ag? Not really. And yet, we do have a yield contest. How many of you participate in the Superior Ag yield contest? Yeah, so actually, you guys can put your hands up. There is nothing embarrassing about saying, hey, I want to try to strive for higher yields. And really, that would be my challenge tonight. I'm not saying that we want to make everyone in here, we don't want to make you all into Trents, but we would like to make you into Mikes, right? And if you identify with Johnny, then I can tell you that stretching and trying to shoot for higher yields is often how you will learn to make better crops on your own farm, right? So let's talk about the components of high yield. And when we think about it, it's a systems approach. I'm not going to give you a recipe. Patrick, I'm not going to tell you that you have to plant this population of this variety and you have to treat it at this time with this thing, right? It's a system. Soybeans are much different than corn. When we talk about a corn system, right, corn is kind of a Jezebel, right? It's like a dog. You pet it a little bit, next thing you know, it rolls over, scratch my belly, right? It responds to any kind of stimulation. But soybeans are not that way, right? You can put everything in, there are cats out there, you can buy them fresh salmon and they still don't love you, right? That's the way soybeans are, right? You have to get the entire system. You have to have the clean litter box and the fresh salmon, and you have to, So soybeans require a systems approach. It is not a recipe. And there are no secrets, right? Right out of the gate, I'm gonna tell you there are no secrets to high yield soybeans excepting we don't manage deep enough into the season. If you look at the sign over here, it says starting strong is good, but finishing strong is epic, right? I probably will not get to it because I get long-winded, but I can tell you that look at where we're at today. 3.5 weeks ago, I basically did some internal training talking about stress mitigation. And I thought the natives, right, this was an internal meeting, I thought the natives were going to skin me and run me out of there. They had the tar heated up, they had the feathers pulled, and they were ready to get after me. Today, we're sitting here with a soybean crop that has probably 6+ inches, Tony, of usable moisture under it. Do you think it's likely to run out of moisture before we get to R7, at least R6? Not very likely, right? And when is the story of soybean yields written? It's written in August, exactly. And so there is still a lot of potential out there. Now there are some 3.1s and 3.2s that were planted in April that are probably already a little too far. You're not going to be able to probably add a lot to those. But there are still a lot of late planted soybeans that are maybe at R3.5 that still would benefit from a little bit of extra care. And so if there is one takeaway, never abandon soybeans. You can have soybeans that absolutely look terrible and make late season amendments. And this is one of the things that you learn from contest winners. I never personally thought Kip Kohler was that nice a person, but I can tell you, you could learn things from like a Kip Kohler. And one of the things he would often say is that anything that delays senescence can have a profound impact on yield, and I believe that. So, systems approach is what works. When I talk about variety selection, you have to pick varieties that have 100 bushel or whatever your yield goal potential is, right? There are some varieties that really don't have that yield potential. There are other varieties that might have that kind of yield potential, but they maybe have some skeleton in their closet, right? There are often pathogens that we can fix with fungicide. If we're talking about the Cercosporas, whether it's Cercospora leaf spot, or we're talking about frog eye leaf spot or septoria, those are things that we can easily fix with fungicide. But if you pick a variety that happens to be weak on Fusarium vulgariforme, which is SDS, or it's weak on stem canker, or it's weak on macrophamina like charcoal rot, right? I can't resurrect those. They are going to die prematurely, and they are going to be disappointing on yield every time. So variety selection, and particularly around disease tolerance, is really, really critical. Another key thing is premium seed treatment, right? At Superior Ag, they treat nearly everything with Warden CX. This last year, this is actually their local data. They actually piloted, there was a few of these across the entire company with WinField, and Superior Ag was one of them. They piloted a new active ingredient. And the branding will be called Warden CX2. But what it is it's still a big rate of mefenoxam, which is apron. That's a water mold compound. It has a big dose of fludioxonil, that's Maxim. It has a big dose of sidaxane, which is the component that's in, what is it? It's, I can't remember. I work in actives, not in, in part of it's because of the camera is on, but it is another component for rhizoctonia. And then the new component, the new fungicide that's on there, which is Viantis is the trade name. I can remember the trade name on it. It actually is 1,000 times more active on Pythium than what was just mefenoxam, right? So we have a couple of new products in the market. One of them is the oxythiopiperlin, which is the Lumicina molecule. That is really good on Phytophthora, does increase control of Pythium. The Viantis molecule is probably going to be a little better on Pythium and secondary control on Phytophthora. Both Warden CX, Warden CX2, both have thiamethoxam. Thiamethoxam is the systemic insecticide that gives us not only control of early season pests, like, well, you can see here's a treated versus untreated, but here is an example of where you had Warden CX2. Wouldn't have made any difference here whether it was Warden CX2 or Warden CX, but you can see the untreated over here is full of bean leaf beetle holes. And so it will still have thiamethoxam, which is an excellent active ingredient. And it turns out that it actually helps with early season vigor. Now, I'm not convinced that we need a lot of early vigor, but when you look at the key components to high yield soybeans, one of those components is what? One of the components is around modest seeding rates, and another component is around early planting. You guys all agree with that? How many times have you planted early? Beans stay fairly modest statured, right? And you get into them at the combine, they're barely over your knees, and you're like, well, these don't look that great, and they're 65 bushel beans. You start extrapolating, because that's what we do as farmers, right? We're sitting in the combine, we got a little time, we're like, son of a gun, man, if these coal mine beans were 65 bushel, I get over on the trippet place, and those things are chest high, they're gonna be 75 or 80 bushel beans. Is that the way it works out, Tony? Almost never, is it, right? And the reason being is because I'm gonna share a couple things with you about the physiology of soybeans. And one of those is, if we want to raise really high yielding soybeans, we have to have modest seeding rates for light interception, right? We've all been trained to believe that you have to have the ground completely covered. You have to have a full stand, and yet, when you start researching it, you will find that there are growers in Arkansas that have been raising 100 bushel soybeans for more than a dozen years, and out of all their records, you might have a handful or less that actually did it in 7.5 or 15-inch rows. Most of them were raised in 30 and 38-inch rows, 38 twin rows, right, on ridges. And so I tell you this, not because I want you to think about going to 30-inch rows, I'm just saying that planting early and using modest seeding rates is absolutely a key component to top yields. And oh, by the way, if you're going to plant early, do you get a better stand or you get a poorer stand, Glenn? Typically you get a poorer stand, right? And so if you're going to plant early and you're going to use modest seeding rates and you're thinking you're probably going to have more mortality, how do you mitigate that? You're going to do it with seed treatments, right? You're going to go to premium seed treatments. So this system is really, really important. You can't just pick and choose. You need to involve the entire system. Oftentimes we'll have growers mid-season say, you know what, boy, I got good looking beans over there. I want to jack them up. And you come to find out that they've got them at 180 or 200,000 plants, and you get out in them and they look like this. Is this possible to jack this plant up? It's got 3 and 4 inch internodes. Right? With 3 and 4 inch internodes, I don't care how much nutrition we throw at this plant, what it's probably going to do is get big and growthy. It's going to lodge 3 times before we harvest it, and it's probably going to be the most beautiful, robust 50 bushel beans we've ever cut, right? In contrast, when we have beans that are a little thinner, oftentimes they do more branching, and instead of that average of 20 nodes, we might go to 25 nodes or 28 nodes. And all of these metrics will contribute to yield. And then by managing them a little more intensely, what ends up happening is we don't have the same kind of abortion. Let me get away from this slide for a minute and talk just a little bit about plant physiology. And this may make more sense. In this part of the world, we raise what? Indeterminate soybeans. They grow vegetatively and reproductively at the same time. Typically they'll have about 20 nodes, and that's assuming that we don't plant them thinner and they put on more nodes by putting on more branches. But this middle bullet point is absolutely key. The closest leaf at any node provides most of the photoassimilate that fills the pods of that node. So in other words, when I talk about modest populations, it's about light infiltration. If we don't get light to the lower nodes, they do not put on pods because there's no light to these trifoliates, right? The reason why you often walk into a field and you're swimming through them and you see these big long petioles this long is because if that leaf does not make it to sunlight, it cannot contribute to the pods at that node. So that's why sometimes you'll see what seems to be counterintuitive wide rows actually having an advantage even on narrow rows. But Tony, if we start out with wide rows, do we have more or less weed pressure? We're going to have more weed pressure. If we plant modest populations, we're going to have more or less weed pressure. We're going to have more, right? And so all of this is something you have to calibrate into your decisions, right? If you've got a mess and you're planting early, do you have more or less weed pressure when you plant early, right? Yeah, it's true that water hemp's going to germ over about a 2-month period, but if you got a crop in the ground when that 2 months starts, guess what? Now you've got a lot longer battle. And so I'm not saying we willy-nilly go into this and just plant every acre on wide rows and plant it early and use really modest seeding rates, because here's the other thing, that also builds on itself. When you start out, Scott, at modest seeding rates, do you think those beans grow faster, or do you think they stay more reduced in stature? The earlier you plant and the thinner you plant, typically the more, I would say, the less vigor they appear to have. If you guys have ever planted beans at 120,000 plants and you go watch them, especially early planted, I mean, you're out there kicking dirt clods the second week of June saying, oh my gosh, are these things ever going to take off? Well, it's because they are not competing for light, which is going to aid them down the road when they're in reproduction and the plant isn't shitting, pods off of it, right? That's when there's an advantage to that. But starting out, it is a huge disadvantage. And so all these are things that you need to know before you just, kind of lackadaisically go into that. Here's the other reason why we really need to think about how we set the crop up. It's a lot like wheat, right? When we think about high yield wheat, we don't start with, okay, well, we're going to run a couple fungicide passes, and we're going to put some nutritionals on it, and we're going to jack the nitrogen up. No, put some palisade on there and shorten it up. Is that where we start with wheat? If it is, you're not a big wheat grower. Good wheat growers start with, hey, what is the target for heads that we want per square yard? And oh, by the way, what is the optimum number of tillers? And then they divide that out to find out what the optimum seeding rate is. And then they manage the nitrogen to make sure that it doesn't tiller more than the optimum amount. So at the end of the day, they end up with the right number of heads per square yard. It's the same thing with soybeans, right? And so here's another one of those little secrets. Did you notice how that thin plant that was obviously overpopulated, did you notice how there's hardly any nodes, any pods on it at all? Wasn't even hardly any flowers or even any spent flowers on it. Guys, the majority, the largest majority of the flowers and pods on a soybean plant actually abscise off that plant, probably in excess of 60%. When we thin the plants, right, we give them more space, and when we do things like use nutritionals, Peter, or we use multiple passes of fungicide to kind of relieve some of these stress precursors, right, these programmed cell death compounds that lead to premature senescence, oftentimes we keep more of those pods on the plant, right? By the way, this structure right here, pretty important. This is called a raceme. Typically have a couple of racemes per node. You don't see that, right? You don't normally see that. You normally see a raceme per node, and normally it has about a half a dozen pods at the absolute most. What do you guys normally see at a particular node in your field? You walk out here, you won't find probably more than 4 beans at any node. You plant them a little thinner, you tease them, prop them up with some nutritionals, and typically they'll yield substantially more. So, by the way, this is some new data. I don't know, we have a lot of time to work on this, but it's always been curious, where does the yield come from when we plant early? Right? If you look at Purdue's metrics, right? I'm a Purdue graduate, I'm very proud of my alma mater, and yet it turns out that when you look at pod number, that doesn't appreciably change between the 1st of April and the middle of May, right? I'm not saying late plant. We go to June, there's a big difference in pod number, right? And node number. So first of all, node number doesn't appreciably change. If we look at pod number, it doesn't appreciably change. We look at the beans per pod, that doesn't appreciably change. I'm talking about between the 1st of April and the middle of May. Those do not appreciably change. In fact, if you look at seed size, it goes backward. As we get later, the seed size typically gets bigger. So how do you account for the fact that early planted soybeans almost always out yield? I mean, it's like a steady progression, right? The yield, if you looked at the curve, right, for you guys, it would be like this, right? Here'd be early planted, and it almost is linear, right? Going down. Well, this potentially explains that. This is some data that came out of South America, and it got to me secondhand through Ignacio Sempiti and Jeff Nagel. And basically, some folks down in South America did some research to determine that when we plant early, it turns out that if the beans get into reproduction earlier in the season, they tend to not compete as much, right, with themselves. In other words, the racemes, right, this cluster of flowers, there will be less inter-raceme competition and less intra-competition between the racemes. So, in other words, within the same raceme, the flowers don't compete as much against one another, and between the two racemes, there's less competition. And the result is that 60% of flowers and pods that normally abort don't abort, right? You don't abort as many. So you know, I think everybody understands fungicides from the perspective, right? This is, by the way, is the data on where photosynthate is sequestered by that leaf. But let's get to this one, because this is the money shot. And I think everyone pretty much recognizes the value of a fungicide for mitigating pathogen, right? Mitigating disease. Would everybody agree with that? You all understand how it enhances yield by mitigating disease. Does everybody understand that fungicides, especially strobilurine fungicides, also help mitigate stress? Are you guys familiar with that? So when plants become stressed, like we were 2 or 3 weeks ago, Tim, and you were really, really dry, you know, one of the first things that plants do is they start producing things like abscisic acid, right? And they start producing things like ethylene. Actually, the very first plant growth regulator they typically produce is indoleacetic acid. And God designed soybeans and corn to produce that to actually encourage adventitious rooting. So if the plant starts getting, if the soil starts getting dry, the plant communicates through IAA, indoleacetic acid, hey, down there, well, you need to step it up. We need more water. So the plant produces more adventitious rooting. It mines the area that it already had roots more thoroughly, right? Producing a temporal lull in the stress. But what happens then? Well, it uses that moisture up, and then it really stresses. So it starts producing more ethylene. Then it produces more abscisic acid. Then you start having the production of these superoxides, right? These are all programmed cell death compounds that actually eventually end up killing the plant prematurely. And you're saying, Glenn, that cannot be right. How is it possible that a plant would be designed to kill itself off? Well, that's not the design. The design is to actually accelerate maturation, right? That's what the plant is doing. The plant is trying to accelerate maturation. It doesn't care how much seed, it just wants viable seed. And by the way, it's not conscious, but that's how it was designed, was to produce viable seed. So what ends up happening when we use fungicides and we use nutritionals, oftentimes we see a response that is well in excess of what you would expect. So when we use products, one of the common products that we've been using pallets and pallets of, and you can tell there's a lot of marketing around high K, right? You can see there's a lot of graphics on here. This is bullshit, right? This is a, I wouldn't say this is an inexpensive product. It's like Miracle Grow for soybeans, but it's a fairly low margin product, but we use it as kind of the stock, as kind of the root. And if I got into, the last week of June and I wanted to make a fungicide application, the week prior, I'd probably take a tissue sample, plan on using this as the base stock, right? And then adding whatever nutritionals the tissue sample called for on top of that. And we found this to be really, really successful. But I got to tell you, for years, I trained on high yield soybeans, and it was like, how is this possible that something that has, 5 pounds of that has 1.5 pounds of potassium. 1.5 pounds of potassium, Patrick, is not even a day's worth of potassium. The uptake of potassium in soybeans is huge. And so how do you account for these 10 and 15 and 20 bushel? I'm a contest, I participate in the contest. They don't allow me to win, but I love to participate in the contest. And I was at 104.6. I'm telling you, when you get in 104 bushel soybeans, you can't wait to get back in 104 bushel soybeans, right? It's the funnest day because you know you're making money, and most of the time we're not spending, right? We're not Trents, we're Mikes. But again, I go back to how is it possible? Well, it's probably, and I've run this past, Dr. Hagley and Dr. Brown and some folks that I really respect. And I said, is it possible that what we're doing is we're kind of resetting the clock on these programmed cell death compounds? And that reduction in stress keeps us from ever getting to that tipping point where we make too much abscisic acid and we actually cause the pods to fall off the plant. Because the dirty little secret is the plant aborts the majority of the pods and flowers. And they agreed that that's probably what it is. I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you that our folks that have been doing this program, fortunately I've been able to coach either on my own farm or with other growers, a lot of guys into the largest soybean yields they've ever made. Part of that is around nutritionals. Part of that, guys, is around fungicide use. Wayne, I don't want anybody to leave here with the wrong information. If we make one application of fungicide, at what R stage would we make that application? What R stage would you make a single application of fungicide? Would you do it at R3 or would you do it at R2 or R4? If you made one application. Tony says 3. Final answer? You agree with Tony? Okay. How about you boys? You agree that it's R3 or R2? R4? Yeah, so Tony was actually correct. If you make one application, ladies and gentlemen, it's R3. What is R3? R3 is when you have a 3/16 inch pod at the top of the plant, right? In the uppermost 4 branches, if you have a 3/16 pod, you are at R4. At R3. And if you're at R3 and you're gonna make one fungicide application, that's when you make it. Now, the reason why he didn't want to answer is because he doesn't make R3 applications, he makes 2 applications. If we're gonna make 2 applications, when do you make them? Right, that's the question. Well, first of all, I want to get away from R stages, Mike, because R stages are misleading. That phenology system was probably made up at Iowa State, which that's a second-rate university compared to Purdue, right? And secondly, if you look at how they describe phenology, they say that there's not nodes, that there's not, axillary nodes at the cotyledons and the unifoliates, and we know there is. And so I can tell you that it's very, very confusing. Here's what I'm going to tell you to make your first fungicide application. When those rows knit together, right, what is changing? What's changing is the environment under that canopy is getting wetter, right? And it's becoming a better environment for pathogens. So when that row starts to close, that's when we go make a tissue sample so we know what to treat with for nutritionals, and that's when we make our first fungicide pass within probably a week to 10 days. What you're doing then is you're cleaning up the septoria. That also does something else. When you make that R2 application here, right, here's R2, you get how many days out of a fungicide? How many? 14 to 21? Yeah, you're exactly right. If you're using a mid-tier product, it's probably going to be 2 to 3 weeks. And that's probably what you would use at R2. What that affords you then is that allows you to go into not R3, but into R4, R4.5, much closer to reproduction when you're actually going to fill the pods. This curve is the biomass accumulation uptake, right? When we get to R3 right here, R3 is typically about the second week of July. You guys realize that you've only actually accumulated about a third of your biomass, and you haven't accumulated any biomass in seed. So if you're making one pass of fungicide, you make it here at R3, because if you make it any later, you miss the septoria and you lose all the nodes off the bottom of the plant. And if you make it any earlier, it runs out of steam before you get to where you're actually making seed. So this is the reason why we have so many growers that are using multiple passes of fungicide. And I know we're out of time, but I will. But I'm telling you, they're still hungry. They want to know the takeaway. Here's the takeaway: we need to manage deeper into the season. If we manage deeper in the season, we're likely to reduce those programmed cell death compounds. We'll delay senescence, and delaying senescence will have a profound impact on yield, will it not, Adam? That's right. If you guys have questions, I can be around, but I don't want to keep you through dinner, because I did that earlier, and then it made me late for dinner, okay? So, any questions?
What do you consider the optimum rate for seeding?
Yeah, so if we're... Yeah, and you're on 15-inch rows, I assume? Yeah, so if I was in 15-inch rows, they say you know what a guy believes, but what he does, right? I would love to sow 120,000, ended up with 110, 105 to 110, but I'm telling you, it's hard to do. If you do that, and then you'll wear the wheels off your pickup looking at them. So try to start at 135 if you're new to it. It depends on the ground, right? If this is a piece of common ground, then you probably need to start at 135 or 140 and hope to end up at 120. If it's a really good piece of ground, right, where you know you're going to get just exaggerated vegetative growth, then absolutely you pull them down from the very get-go, right? Does that make sense? I do not disturb a stand. If we have more than 80,000 plants and they're evenly distributed, you have a wonderful pallet to paint in, right? You get 160,000 plants, I don't care how evenly they're distributed, I can't fix that, right? They're too thick and they're going to go down. Yes, ma'am.
Planted May 1st, they're Asgrow 38s.
Yep, 3/8.
Cold and wet this year in bottom ground, so it's really cold and wet. No tilled in, 15-inch rows. Looking at them, they look like it's not. You'll go through a few spots, dig them up. There's seed treatment to the max. Worms eating them, just sprouted. Some of them died because it got wet and it dried up.
Yep. But are they still evenly distributed? The remainder, are they evenly distributed?
More or less.
Okay.
The population we counted was anywhere between some were 50,000, some were 80,000, but no more than 80,000.
Okay.
A, should we have left them? Or two, should we have went back through it and I planted at an angle and I put back 90,000 in to fill in?
Yeah. So
50,000 population.
Yeah, so that is so subjective, and I'm still going to answer it, right?
Okay.
Probably shouldn't. But if it were me, it would be hard to leave 50 to 80,000 plants, even if they're evenly distributed, because you have so many voids and because we have weed pressure everywhere.
Yeah.
But that's assuming that you have conditions that you can go in and spot in, right? If you don't have the conditions to spot in, then you better leave them, right? You don't want to just mud in more. I would say this. I think that traditionally we have always discouraged anybody from spotting in crops. And so here's the deal. We've always discouraged people from spotting in crops, and I think that is crazy applicable to corn. I am not convinced that it's applicable to soybeans, because in my travels and my talks on soybeans, it is amazing how many growers I run into that the best beans they ever cut were actually where they went in and freshened up and planted into an existing stand. And what I believe that is you're seeing what they've done is they now have soybeans, they basically broadened the window of reproduction is what they've done. And it's not, I'm not saying that happens every time, but with some regularity, guys will have these crazy. So spotting in with soybeans is not that's not the end of the world. Spotting in on corn, shame on you. No spotting in on corn. You tear it up and put in a new crop, right? 60 to 80,000 plants, if it was earlier, I would say, you know what, let's put some 20-20-20. There's a sister to High K that just jacks soybeans up like crazy. and it would make them fill in.
You wanna know what they look like now?
They probably look beautiful now.
They do, but I don't know for sure if those that would come back and replant the 90,000, if any of those ever made it out because of shading from the plants that were in there. But if you looked at now, you would never think that was the field that was there.
Oh no.
Spring.
Well, they all look that way this year, right? And so again, it really so to your point, we have a lot of fields that started out in less than optimal conditions, less than optimal stands. They have recovered. We've even lost plants from Phytophthora. And normally I'd say, you know what, let's not throw good money after bad. But when you have this much usable moisture and you still have the potential to throw, 3, 5, 7 bushel on them, I think it's really shame on you if you don't try to, obviously we're talking about aerial application versus ground application, that's more expensive, but there's potential